Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, we have on the floor a budget that balances in 10 years without raising taxes and gives us the opportunity to put the repeal of Obamacare on the president's desk. We anticipate not having much Democratic interest in this. I think it is noteworthy. Apparently, they're not going to offer an amendment, a budget of their own, which leads me to believe they were happy with what the president offered, which never balances ever. I want to call on some members of the Budget Committee to give you their take on the budget. I'll start with Senator Ayotte.
I want to thank our leader. First of all, I think that let's think about where we are. The 4 years I've been in the Senate, only once did the Democrats actually do the budget in 2013. So this is important, what we did in committee last week to have a fiscal blueprint for the nation. One of the issues I've been concerned about from the beginning as a member of the Armed Services Committee is, given the threats and challenges that we are facing around the world right now, the proposal in sequester on the defense of the nation in terms of how we're resourcing our Department of Defense, I've said is inadequate. And Senator Graham and I had an amendment that we offered in the Budget Committee that was adopted by all of our members that will increase defense spending, including $38 billion in additional funding for OCO, overseas contingency funding, bringing DoD spending to a total of $612 billion. Well, I think that is very important. This will provide the resources that we need, and frankly, going forward, that we may need additional resources. But this, not only does our budget balance in 10 years, but we are addressing this defense spending piece, I think, in an important way. And I'm someone who voted against the Budget Control Act. Also included in this agreement is what's called a deficit neutral reserve fund, which would allow us also going forward, if the Democrats want to work with us on a bipartisan resolution to the Budget Control Act. That's an important first step in that direction. So this is a responsible budget, one that addresses the nation's fiscal priorities. And most importantly, we've also addressed the number one priority for the country, which is defending the nation. And so I'm glad that our amendment got included. And I want to thank the chairman of the Budget Committee, Senator Enzi, for his leadership and all his work on this, and the other members of the committee. Thank you.
This is an opportunity for us to begin to get our fiscal house in order. You think about it, there hasn't been a budget in the United States Congress for 6 years. And what's our fundamental responsibility here? The power of the purse, and the Constitution says every dime appropriated's got to go through Congress. And one reason we've had these record levels of debt and deficit is there hasn't been any constraint, there hasn't been any budget, there hasn't been any fiscal blueprint to be able to keep our house in order. So this is a process that I'm proud to be part of. Every member of Congress, Republican or Democrat alike, will have an opportunity to offer their ideas. We just had a couple of amendments voted on the floor. One was one I offered, which was bipartisan. It had to do with some of the most vulnerable kids among us, those with complex medical problems, how to have the Medicaid program work better for them. It improves their care through coordination. It also saves the Medicaid program money. These are the kinds of things that we're going to be seeing on the floor, and I welcome those. The reason we need a budget so badly is we now have a record level of debt, and hundreds of billions of dollars is being spent out of Washington, more than is taken in every year. In fact, in the last 5 years of this administration, we've added $7 trillion to the debt. That's $56,000 per household in Ohio and around the country. Think about that. In the president's budget, by the way, he adds another $8 trillion of debt on top of that $7 trillion. By the time this president's out of office, it's very likely that he will have added more to the debt, the public debt, than every single president in the history of our country combined. This budget, on the other hand, actually gets to balance over 10 years. It actually begins the process of not just stopping spending hundreds of billions of dollars more every year than you take in, but also the process of getting our debt down. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has looked at this issue and said, you know what, having these high levels of debt and deficit hurts the economy. It's really no wonder we've had the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we have this overhang of debt and deficit. So as a Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, we need to figure out how to come together on this budget and then have an appropriations process where we're actually prioritizing spending and where we actually do make good on our commitment to the American people to use our constitutional prerogatives to get this spending under control and to get back to the kind of fiscal discipline that every American has to live with in their family, every American has to live with in their business. It's time for Washington to do the same.
I'd like to concentrate on what this budget does and what it doesn't do. I mean, what it does is what Senator Portman was just talking about. It actually sets up a governing process, a control over an appropriation process, so that we can start prioritizing spending. We can start looking at all these appropriation measures and start working in a thoughtful way to start eliminating duplicated programs, eliminate fraud, eliminate waste in federal spending, because there may be a difference in terms of how much government those of us on the Republican side versus the Democrat side want, but we can come together and agree that what we do spend should be spent wisely and efficiently. So that process where Leader McConnell has talked about returning to a regular order, respecting the rights of the minority party, let them offer amendments in an appropriation process. That's a very good thing. That's the primary thing I think this budget does as well, set up, like Leader McConnell said, reconciliation to start repealing Obamacare. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't solve our nation's problems. It certainly doesn't solve all the fiscal challenges. But we're going to need presidential leadership. I've told the story repeatedly. I told it during our budget process where we did pass an amendment unanimously that will allow our long-term projections to be expressed in dollars so the American people actually understand the depth of the problem. I come from a manufacturing background. If you're going to solve a problem, the first step is you have to admit you have one. So I want to tell the story of our working with the White House, trying to start coming to areas of agreement with their debt and deficit. And what I brought to that process, being one of the smaller group of Republican senators working at the White House a year or so ago, I brought my accounting skills. I brought my definition of the problem. And the fact is, we don't have a 10-year budget window problem. We have a 30-year demographic problem. All the baby boom generation, we're retiring at the rate of 10,000 people per day. We made all these promises. We haven't made a provision to pay for it. And so if you look at the CBO's alternate fiscal scenario over the next 30 years, they project a deficit of, hold on to your hats, $126 trillion. It's about 8 or 9 trillion the first decade, 31 trillion the second decade, 88 trillion the third decade. Now, when I was in the White House for about a 2-hour meeting, President Obama joined us for the last half of that meeting. He wanted everything on the table for discussion. Fair enough. I said, Mr. President, if you want everything on the table, this is how you get it on the table. Use your bully pulpit. Go to the American public. Show them the truth. Show them the depth of the problem. Show them this massive deficit projection over the next 30 years. You know what he said to me? He said, Ron, we can't show the American people numbers that big. If we do, they'll get scared. They'll give up hope. And he says, besides, Ron, we can't do all the work. We have to leave some work for future presidents, future Congresses. That's the problem. If we're going to solve these problems, we need presidential leadership. We do not have a president of the United States right now who's interested in that. So I've got a relatively modest goals for this current budget, and it really is, let's have this, let's get it passed so it will actually guide that appropriation process. We can do a lot of good work. We can start that process of regular order. And again, I commend Leader McConnell for understanding that, and I commend Senator Enzi for working really hard to produce a budget that we can pass, hopefully with unanimous Republican support. Hopefully we can reconcile that with the House, and I'm looking forward to that process. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Well, you got to hear from the other accountant on the Budget Committee and in the United States Senate, and I've been pleased to be the budget chairman. You've got to remember that we've had 8 weeks to put a budget together, and I had to go back through records of 6 years that it hasn't been done. So it's a minor miracle, I think, to get to the point where we have it done. The main purpose of the budget is to give some guidance to the spending committees, and the deadline, the statutory deadline for finishing a budget is April 15th, and we anticipate that we'll be able to meet that. That'll probably be some kind of a record, too. Why April 15th? Well, it's a very significant day in America when everybody have to pay their taxes, but it's also when the appropriators, the spenders, can begin putting their pieces together, the specific part. One of the frustrations by the other side is that we did what you're supposed to do for a budget, which is to outline the categories and the process for enforcement. and there isn't a lot of detail in there. So you're hearing a lot of detail being projected on what might be done. But I believe that the committees are responsible people that have expertise in the areas that they serve in, and so they can look through those things and come up with maybe ideas that we didn't even be able to consider. And that's the way that it's always worked in the United States Senate. Of course, we also have authorizing committees. These are the committees that come up with the programs. They're committees that are designed around specific areas. And one of my emphasis will be to get them to look at their authorizations. An authorization is a bill that explains what they can do, how we'll know if they're getting it done, and how much can be spent. Well, when I checked, I found that there were 260 programs that have expired. One of them expired in 1983, but we're still funding it. And we're paying out $293 billion a year for programs that technically have expired. So we need to be looking at all of those things if we're going to get America's picture back in order again. I think we have a blueprint for being able to get our budget balanced in 10 years, and I'm looking forward to April 15th and having that done so we can get started on the next year and have more than 8 weeks. So,
Thanks, Mike.
Mr. Leader, if there's a deal on trade promotion authority and a bill is introduced when you come back from the April recess, how quickly would you be able to schedule more time?
Well, as I've said previously, there are two areas of possible agreement with the administration, trade and cybersecurity. I'm hoping the Finance Committee will be able to get a trade promotion authority out of the committee very quickly after we come back, and it's a top priority for me. I've had a number of conversations with the President about it. It's a top priority for him. Hopefully this is something we can do together.
Senator, any update on the human trafficking bill, the next steps, and by extension on Loretta Lynch?
Well, I continue to hope that we can get past the dilemma that you've all witnessed on the trafficking bill and go forward with that and then turn to the Lynch nomination. I know there are people on both sides of the aisle trying to figure out how to get past the impasse, and I hope they can do that, and I wish them well.
Senator McConnell, do you intend to take up Iran legislation when you come back from recess?
Well, I think the first step is to see what happens. I know today is apparently one of the deadlines. Has there been an announcement about what, if anything, happened today, March the 24th? Okay, well, I think the first step is to see whether they get some kind of an agreement. Second step will be determined in part by whether or not there's yet another delay. But I can say this, we will be taking up the Corker-Menendez proposal at some point if there is an agreement. We are hopeful that there will be as many as 67 senators who will say to the President, we really do need to be able to approve the final agreement. If there is no agreement, then I think a good candidate for consideration would be the Kirk-Menendez proposal, which would ratchet up the sanctions on the Iranians. Since we all know that sanctions are the only thing that seems to have worked so far, another heavy dose of sanctions would be an appropriate remedy if there's no agreement at all. Thank you.
Will you take up the dot fix as soon as the House passes?